So hi, here's AMI. We are actually coming to you from Lynn Lawrence's office here in Amsterdam, and welcome to our AMI talks on this very special day. So today, again, we're delighted to see so many faces from around the world on a date when the international world recognizes the value of the work done by women and the contributions they make to society. And this is also a date on which a Pavlov reaction kicks in. We as Montessorians, of course, at once think of Maria Montessori, especially as one whose core business was in the empowering industry. My name is Joke, and I'm part of the AMI Legacy team that helps organize these AMI talks, where we connect you and ourselves with speakers that have so much to offer. Today, the rest of our event team that makes this talk happen are Faye, Julia, and Anthony. And we're truly grateful that, again, we have a brilliant lineup for you. We will briefly introduce our speakers, but before we do, I wanted to share a new Netflix series with you. You might be surprised. Not because I'm encouraging you to spend your time in front of a screen, but because this series is an excellent example of what obstacles were met by women in late 19th century. The series is called Lydia Poet, I hope I pronounced it correctly, Avvocato, or The Law According to Lydia Poet. We find ourselves in Turin, Italy, around 1883. Maria Montessori is then 13 years old. Upon gaining her law degree, Lydia wants to join the Order of Lawyers and Prosecutors of Turin. That, however, is the start of an all-obstacle course. At first admitted, alack, this decision is overturned, and she is barred from practicing. It's precisely these challenging circumstances that Maria Montessori herself also met. And the series give you an idea of the fabrics of society, the progressives and the conservatives, but also what did traffic look like, the dresses. So to be enjoyed and learned from at various levels. After the two presentations, we will have 15 minutes to answer any questions you may have. And please put these in the chat, and we'll gladly relay them either to Noah Sobe or Beverley Maragh. Now it's time to head over to our presenters. And we'll start with Professor Noah Sobe, who is no stranger to Montessori education. He is the author of Challenging the Gaze, the subject of attention and the 1915 Montessori demonstration classroom, something that we know as the glass classroom. Noah is Professor of Modern European History in the College of Arts and Sciences at Loyola University, Chicago. His scholarship includes work in the history of childhood and the history of emotions, and he's treated topics such as attentiveness and boredom in school, World's Fairs, again, the glass classroom, and international expositions and international curriculum history. From 2019 to 2022, while on leave from his academic position, Noah worked as Senior Project Officer at UNESCO on the Future of Learning and Innovation team, where he helped to lead the research and drafting of the UNESCO flagship report, Reimagining Our Futures Together. So that just goes to show that knowledge of legacy builds for the future. So I'm delighted to give over the screen to Noah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joke. Let me share my screen. I've got some slides that I want to use as part of my talk today. First, again, it's an honor to be here, especially on such an important day, March 8th, International Women's Day. As was just mentioned, I'm a historian of education who also works on the futures of education, most recently at UNESCO, as you heard. And for me, the past and the future are two halves of the same whole. And I suppose that whole is the stories that we can tell about possibility, how things have been different and will be different from the way they are now. So what I'm going to do today is explore the concept of childhood as a historical object. Yes, there have always been children. Birth, being born into the world, the principle of natality is one of the most important forces in the world. But how people have thought about the time of childhood in the human lifespan, that's been quite different in different times and spaces. So I'm going to talk about ways that a proper protected childhood was understood at the time of Montessori's first work in education. Then I will trace some of the ways that childhood changed across the 20th and 21st centuries, again, differently in different places. And at the end, I'll discuss an argument that's been put forward that in a certain way, childhood has reached its end. Now, I suspect some of you will recognize the image on the left. It's from a 2010 French documentary film titled Babies that I heartily recommend. The image on the right is one that I often use to teach with, just to surprise my students. It's an 1884 photograph of future US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was 7 years old. Has something fundamentally changed now that we hover over every single detail of children's lives? What has become of innocence, exploration, protection from the world? In the United States, the Common Core curriculum expects kindergarten education to be college and career ready. So we need to ask, what does the anxiety and polarization that affects the lives of so many around the world, what consequences does this have for our children and their childhood? My starting point, of course, is that childhood has a history, and this history is important. So let me begin with a story about childhood that many of you will probably be familiar with. It's one made famous by the French historian Philippe Ariès, who claimed in a book in the early 1960s that in medieval Europe, the idea of childhood did not exist. His book is actually more richer than this, but you may know that he looks at art and argues that because we don't see children portrayed much in medieval art, childhood as a distinct condition with distinct needs did not exist for Europeans in the Middle Ages. Now here on the left, you have a nice balding baby Jesus from the late 13th century. It's a tempera and gold panel painting, now in a museum in Tuscany. And on the right, you have a pretty muscled baby Jesus, been going to the gym, in a 15th century book of hours from Siena. You know, we do see a red coral necklace, which was believed to protect children from disease. But the main point that Ariès wants us to take from this visual evidence is that children are appearing in these and similar paintings as small adults. Now, I hope I'm not disappointing you, but historians of childhood today consider this argument to be mostly wrong. This Bruegel painting of children playing a host of games, it's slightly later period, but it reminds us that certain styles of behavior were seen as childlike and child appropriate. And there are other representations of children in European medieval art, and the claim that there was no idea of childhood in medieval Europe actually seems quite incorrect. But to be fair to Ariès, part of what has propelled this mistaken interpretation is the fact that sentiment, the original French word that Ariès used, was translated into English as idea. Now, if we render this as a sentiment of childhood, a feeling and a concept, then he starts to seem more accurate. Emotional registers, expressions do change over time, and the ways that we attach to children and the ways that we attach importance to their growth and development do change over time. Incidentally, this painting is in Vienna. I'm only showing you a small detail. It's one of those pieces that you can spend quite a bit of time contemplating and absorbing. It's maybe important to add at this point that there's also real value to broadening our horizons beyond Europe. And there are historians of childhood who've done amazing work in recent decades, talking about the various stages of childhood and youth that have been recognized in cultures around the world. We know that there was an elaborate body of thought and practice around grieving for children, for the death of children in early modern Muslim cultures. We know that in China, there was also an extremely developed science of pediatric medicine, as well as government coordinated public health initiatives directed at children's unique health requirements, also in the early modern period. So this image here is also a small detail of a much larger painting. The Chinese characters outside the shop on the far left tell us that it's a pediatrics clinic. And this detail is from a scroll that's close to 7 meters long and based on a 12th century original by Zhang Zeduan, which you can see in Beijing. So having hopefully established that childhood has a long history, I want to go back to my title and remind you that there is the suggestion that there was at some point a birth of childhood. And what I mean by that is that there's a certain modern notion of childhood that begins to emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries, earlier for some places, later for others. And this is an understanding of childhood as a time of innocence and growth. And it's an understanding that was largely in place at the time that Montessori began her educational work with children. So I think it's most accurate to speak of a gradual unfolding of the modern model of childhood. And again, I think many of you will be familiar with some of the basic contours of this argument. Some of it's captured by John Locke, right? Who in the late 17th century described the child as a tabula rasa, not corrupted at birth, but instead a blank slate or a wax tablet. A heightened awareness of the impressionability of children, the importance of the environments in which they are raised, lent a new importance to education and to mothers and motherhood. And this, of course, is the milieu in which the modern school emerges as well. I particularly like this 1845 American painting for what it captures of this transitional moment. For one, the teaching profession has not been as fully feminized as it was by the end of the 19th century. We see in this young boy's reluctance, we see the mother who's tasked with comforting him. We see a dog even, which is a very bourgeois sign, is suspicious of the boy entering school. And with good reason, because we see that the teacher is holding behind him a switch or a stick with which to impose corporal punishment. In the background, we see children reciting lessons in what's probably a multi-age one-room school. And quite interestingly, our child pupil is referred to as a scholar. The notion of student is something that comes later. So we see the education of children taking on new importance, less for religious purposes and more to educate for goodness, industriousness, even citizenship. We also see a heightened awareness on the strong emotional ties that are needed to unite a successful family, particularly mothers with children, and ensure proper upbringing. In the modern model, childhood was to be converted from a time of work to a time of schooling. And here I show you a photograph taken in the second decade of the 20th century by Lewis Hine in the United States, who did some really extraordinary work documenting laboring children, children working in conditions that were often quite desperate and unsafe. And photographs like this and his work actually helped to mobilize the abolition of child labor. Now, following the work of a number of people, historians like Peter Stearns, Steve Mintz, I'm framing modern childhood as a model because it wasn't a reality for all, as we see here. But it did become the aspirational vision. And the idea was that all children had a right to a childhood. And for that reason, I'd maintain that it's actually, on one level, pretty unremarkable that from the earliest years of Montessori's work, people viewed her innovations as appropriate both for children from slums and from the elite corners of towns. I say unremarkable because it's not surprising. Don't get me wrong. I think it was a great and important thing. So if you'll permit me to play with a visual comparison, let's return to this painting from 1283 and also pull in one from 1796. On the left is the Castel Fiorentino Madonna from the 13th century with the balding baby that we just talked about earlier. And on the right, we have an 18th century French painting of Madame Boyer-Fonfrède and her son. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that this tells us something about a change in sentiment. I'm tempted to say that the apple that we see in the painting on the right has changed from symbolizing original sin to now telling us something about natural growth. In fact, let's center this. This is but one of many representations of a new cultural definition of childhood as a time of protected, cultivated growth. As part of this transformation, we might see enlightenment and romantic notions entering. We probably see birth rate reduction, fewer children per family, and concurrently more investment, emotional and financial, in each child. Relatedly, we're probably also seeing a reduction in the infant death rate, fewer children dying in infancy. And it's maybe not evident in this particular image, but across the 19th century, we also see an increasing interest of the nation state in children and childhood. Of course, something seen in China centuries earlier. What I want to stress, though, is that the model of childhood that develops in Europe and North America, not only, but and definitely not in isolation from the rest of the world, but this model, I would argue, has become globalized across the 20th century. What was held out as an ideal and initially very much attached to elite social positions becomes a model of desired childhoods that has a global presence today. Again, by no means realized by all, and even in some places to any large degree. But this modern notion of what a childhood should be has become something of a worldwide norm for what it expects for children and also for what it expects of mothers, I would add. And we'll hear more from Beverley in a second about our distance from this ideal, as well as what's dangerous and desirable here. So I want to move into the final parts of my presentation and talk about a possible end to childhood. Now, claims like this have been around for some time. Here are two examples from North America. Some of you may remember Neil Postman's 1982 cultural critique, The Disappearance of Childhood, which argued that television was exposing children to adult realities, that children were being sexualized, that adult-child boundaries were disappearing. Then there was a powerful piece of journalistic reporting from the early 1990s by Alex Kotlowitz that brought to the attention of many the lives of two brothers growing up in public housing in Chicago in a world that afforded them no innocence and even less protection. Both of these books were certainly on to something. The place our society holds for children is changing. But I actually think it's necessary to go a bit deeper into childhood itself, particularly into parenting, and see what norms and practices might be changing. Permit me once again to use a crude juxtaposition. We'll look quickly at an advertisement from the 1930s and a cartoon from the 2010s. And I should say that I'm drawing this from the inspiring work of Paula Fass, whose book, The End of American Childhood, has informed much of what I'm going through right now. So on the left here, we have an advertisement for a book subscription service. Parents could sign up for, and it appears that books would come monthly. And we have an apparently successful mother saying, "Thank goodness I didn't train the fun out of my babies. I simply gave them love, the right kind of food, and my book house, the subscription service." Now, obviously, being the right kind of consumer has made her a proper parent, but the overarching message is that provided with the right things and then left alone, children will grow up the right ways. Now, the message on the right is very different. It's a magazine cartoon from an American magazine called The New Yorker, some of you may know, showing two parents carrying a semi-adult child in what looks to be a college graduation ceremony, with the quote, "Sometimes I think we want this more than he does." You know, it speaks to what's sometimes called helicopter parenting, although actually I'd maintain that the term snowplow parenting, where you smooth the road in front of your child, is more accurate. But I think these two cultural artifacts can be taken as illustrating two approaches to child rearing. One is to consider it, you know, the accomplishment of natural growth, and the other is to approach this more as a task of concerted cultivation. Now, this is really the wrong image to illustrate the points I'm going to make next. It's a lovely stock photo image of a mother and child playing together on a playground slide. Paula Fass, whom I mentioned, and others argue that control, above else, has become the guiding principle of successful parenting during the past 30 years. In this way, parents could protect their kids from predators, from unsafe sex, from failure at school. Protection has, in many families, become more important than independence. It's become more important than giving the children the freedom to choose their own futures. So in that sense, you could argue that childhood, as it's evolved over the last 200 years, has come to an end. So to go to this incorrect image, I do think parents should play with children. I have fond memories of playing on playgrounds with my own kids. The problem or the issue is that children both need to be accompanied and they need to be left alone. This mother and daughter seem to have a great relationship, and I'm very glad they're going down this slide together. But I'm going to suggest that what maybe makes their relationship great is that there's a lot of trust. That the supports are there, but perhaps or hopefully not entirely at the expense of independence and a child learning to find their way in the world. What began as taking children out of the labor market has now in many instances returned them to it. As I said at the outset, in the United States, the Common Core curriculum asks that kindergarten education give mind to ensuring that children become college and career ready. Our eagerness to support our children, our anxieties about their and our collective futures sometimes mean that we pay lip service to children's autonomy and their right to self-definition. As the New Yorker cartoon said, sometimes I think we want this more than they do, right? And when we reach that point, it should be a cause for caution. I choose this image here quite deliberately with the expectation that it's going to be unfamiliar to most of you on this call. My suspicion or my hope is that in your minds, you can quickly populate a number of images of Montessori early childhood education that meets this challenge. So I'm not illustrating with a traditional Montessori image because you all are the ones that should be doing this. Now, make no mistake, as we'll hear from Beverley in just a minute, adverse childhoods are all around us in today's world. Recently, the New York Times published an expose on the labor of migrant children in the United States, many of whom are actually working in compliance with the law, shockingly. So there's a huge amount we need to do to remedy childhoods that cost children their futures. But the solution of simply returning to protecting innocence and nurturing growth isn't a perfect answer. There are children who should not be unaccompanied, and there are some who are over accompanied. So I put the challenge for the future of early childhood education as this: needing to protect childhood without over accompanying our children. And here, I'm going to leave it in your hands to tell me whether I'm right, and in your hands to make the case. Here, at least I think that Montessori education offers something that can help us get through. I could close here, but I want to say something about following the child. I know that thought has never occurred to you. Our children have some important messages for us. The better we accompany our children, the better they will accompany us and accompany our more than human world to better futures. I want to reverse the New Yorker cartoon and say, sometimes I think they want this more than we do. And that I think we really need to pay attention to. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noah. This was hugely interesting. And I saw a lot of faces nodding as well. Although we said that we take questions at the end of the presentation, I'd like to invite you to ask any questions to Noah now, as we're waiting for Beverley to join. She's experiencing some technical problems. And so hopefully she'll be able to join us very, very soon. But in the meantime, I think we could capitalize on this being fresh in your mind, what Noah's just shared with us, and ask any questions in the chat, and we'll be happy to relay them. And Noah can also see them in the chat, I think. So my question, Noah, do you think childhood can still be saved?
Absolutely. I mean, we almost have no choice. I mean, there will be a childhood. I think the question is what kind. And it's going to be a childhood that's more engaged with the world, yet it still needs elements of protection. And that's why I find this idea of accompaniment that I was trying to play with in the presentation so useful. I see that in Montessori classrooms that I observe. And I think it's an important larger remedy to some of the problems we face, which is to walk alongside children, right? Which is both, you know, a leading and an allegiance.
Thank you. Well, I do see notes here. Okay, Laura. Noah, do you think then that parenting should be addressed so parents can understand the benefit of this new mindset? Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more, Laura. And I know we're hoping Beverley gets on, but she's the expert here. She's done so. I had the chance to talk with her, and she's done some amazing work on this. I do think, you know, so much of what we do in education is targeted at children and their teachers. We need that, but we also need to involve and engage parents to reflect on ways that they were raised that maybe suit the world and maybe don't suit the world. And I think it's really important that we engage them as active participants in this accompanying of childhood.
We'll just take one more question then, I think, to Noah, which was there. Noah, what do you think about David Elkin's book, The Hurried Child, which was...
Yeah, I mean,
Are you familiar with that title?
Yeah, I am. I mean, I think I framed it as over-managing, overburdening. I mean, I do think we need to simplify our children's lives. We frankly need to simplify our lives too. You know, and you know, like I said, I know it's, you know, crazy for me to suggest following the child to you all, but I think there's a lot we can learn from children about living less hurried lives. Thanks for the question.
That's great. And Eduardo Cuevas, one of our trainers, he, you know, he remarked just in the chat that parent education is so terribly important. I think Beverley is trying to get her PowerPoint to start, but in the meantime, I will just sort of introduce Beverley to you.
Okay, is it possible, have you got a copy that you can put up on the screen?
Yes, we will share your PowerPoint. We'll try and start it up.
Yeah.
We'll try and do that as I introduce you, and Julia's working way ferociously. I'm sure it will work. So Beverley then, so everybody else, she is a lecturer at the Maria Montessori Institute, London, our affiliated centre. Okay, now I've lost my text. sorry guys. So Beverley trained as a nursery nurse, and she worked with children and families in children's centres in and around London's inner city areas. In 1995, she got her AMI primary 6-6 diploma, and then worked as a head teacher in a Montessori daycare before opening her own school. In 2011, Beverley, you gained your AMI 0-3 diploma, a BA in early childhood studies from London Metropolitan University, and a diploma in antenatal care from the University of Worcester. So Beverley is a member of MMI's teaching staff and works with the Born Inside project with mothers and babies and pregnant women in one of Britain's largest female prisons. So trained as a doula, she volunteers with Birth Companions, which works with women that have been disadvantaged by drugs, trafficking, or refugee status. Now, Beverley's contribution really brings another aspect of Maria Montessori's work full cycle. When working as a lecturer in anthropology, that was 1905, 1906, Maria Montessori took her students on trips to an institution for young offenders, where they had actually replaced the wardens for teachers. So, Beverley, I think we're going to start your PowerPoint. I think that will work, and we'll enjoy it. So over to you, Beverley.
Thank you. Thank you, Noah, for that wonderful talk beforehand. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening to us today. Born Inside project is at the moment, I should say, currently not existing at the moment due to COVID. The prison has locked out all voluntary services out of the prison. So all the talk that I'm going to give is up to COVID. So at the moment, currently, we're not able to continue with the project. The project is myself and Pamela Stewart, who is a psychotherapist. And as it says, our work began in 2012, but that's the work actually in the prison. We actually started the work a year before, because it took nearly a year and a half to get into the prison. And we always made a joke, it would be quicker if I committed a crime, I'd get in quicker than waiting to get through all the paperwork. What happened then, in October of 2013, the unit was closed. And that was the only female prison in London. So now any woman who commits a crime, there is no prison within the London area. She is now have to travel 26 miles outside of London, which is where Bronzefield is situated. And we were fortunate we was able to continue our work at Bronzefield, which is the next biggest female prison in the UK. So some background information. On annuals, there's 17,240 children are separated from their mothers who are in prison. 31% of these children have been in local authority care. 40% of these children try to commit suicide. 46% of these women have experienced domestic abuse. 84% of these women are serving minor crimes for things like theft, shoplifting. So they're not even serious crimes, but the judge seems to sentence women more harshly. And only 5% of the children remain within the family homes. The majority of these women live in local authority or council-run homes. So the minute they go to prison, they've also lost their home. And 48% are reconvicted after 1 year of leaving prison. So people always ask, what does the prisoner look like? Well, when I found these pictures, The one on the bottom is actually a picture from the internet, which is in a prison. The top picture is prisoners. We all seem to have an image of what prisoners look like from TV. And even I did until I went there, and I was amazed at the age range, colours, creed, race, nationality, you name it, it was there. There is nobody who can be excluded from being within a prison system. So just because you may come from an affluent background, it doesn't exclude you. Next slide. So over the years that we've done the work, we have worked with 40 women in the pregnancy group. We've had 24 of them receive places on the mother and baby unit. 4 mothers will face separation because they've got longer sentence. 2 babies were removed from their mothers, 1 for violence and 1 due to mental health, and 3 mothers were recalled. So what happens is, when a mother finds out they're pregnant, some women don't even know they're pregnant until they're actually admitted into prison, because one of the things that's done is a pregnancy test. So sometimes that's the first time they even know that they're actually pregnant. So 1, you're in prison, and 2, now you found out that I'm pregnant. So the next thing is there are only 13 spaces on the mother and baby unit for 13 women, and 1 set of twins. And there is 500 women within the system. So again, not everyone is guaranteed a space on the mother and baby unit. We were only allowed for 1 hour a week to run a pregnancy group. And within the pregnancy group, we then had to look at the women, looking at the developmental needs of the baby, looking at the developmental needs of the mother, and as well as her emotional needs, because we also know that the mother's mentality during the time of the pregnancy also affects the unborn baby. So we had to do a lot of work with these women, but one good thing, we built a trust, and they came regularly to these groups, and we were able to share information. Some women were able to leave the prison and continue their pregnancy outside of the prison. Those women who were going to be there, their sentence ran until they gave birth, we were able to support them, write a letter to support their application to the board. And if they were successful, we'd work with them on the mother and baby unit. So as I just said, the mother and baby unit has space for 12 mothers and 13 babies, which 1 room is for twins. So we have worked with women from the ages of 18 to 42. And about 25% of these women that we've been working with, the women, the co-defendants are the fathers of the children. So most of these women, so not only is the mother in prison, that the father is also within the prison system as well. And we've also worked with 3 generations. At one time, we had the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter had given birth within the prison system. So sometimes that, again, we hope that we could break the cycle, because otherwise it's the whole family cycle. And I remember we had a story once, we were working with a young girl who said, I remember coming to visit my mother in this same visiting room, and now she's in the same prison, pregnant, and about to give birth to her first child while in prison. So again, we were looking at how do we break this cycle, constant cycle of abuse that's constantly going on. So some of the challenges we faced is that the mothers always thought a quiet baby is a good baby. But it wasn't that. We always found if there was an upset on the unit, or there was disagreements between the women, or there was something major going on, that these babies were very, very quiet. It's like they could sense there was something not safe. So they would be very quiet or very sleepy, as to not be a bother to their parents. The other pressure that was always on the women was to stop breastfeeding very early, because sometimes this was due to, depending on from the influence of our prisoners, but more from family members, because they always said the baby are not prisoners. So the babies can be passed out to family members within the community. So again, even though there was means to still support breastfeeding, the mothers would eventually just give up. The mothers that continued breastfeeding were the ones we called the foreign nationals, who were here from abroad, who had no family. So they didn't have that influence from the other prisoners or family influence. So they were the ones that were able to continue breastfeeding for as long as possible. The other challenging was clothing and footwear. No matter how much we would talk about clothing as a hindrance to the development of movement, and that babies do not need to wear shoes, that this also seems to be a point of status, especially for women who came from communities that did not wear shoes. So footwear was more than just the footwear for these women. And we had to recognize that, identify that, but also explain that the baby's feet do not need shoes. And the one hard one, which we really faced, was the separation, when it was time to say goodbye, whether the child was leaving to go home or there was a separation because the mother's sentence was going to be long, so they did an early separation so the child is able to be separated before it gets too attached, even though there is, we know about attachment and separation in early years, that this child is able to separate from the mother and form a new relationship with the family members, if going into a family. Some babies were separated straight at birth and then were put straight up for adoption. So each case was done on an individual situation, but regardless of what the case was, we worked with that mother individually to meet their needs during that time of separation. So many people will say, well, how did you use the Montessori approach? We were only given 1 hour a week with the pregnancy women and 1 hour a week with the mothers of babies. So again, within that time, we're very constrained with time, but we use it in a way that we, you know, as I said, we had built relationships with the mothers one. We also had to work within the constraint of the prison. So we had to respect what the prison rules was around movement with babies and allowing them. But we were given a room, and in this room, we were able to get a blanket, put it on the floor, and encourage these mothers to put the babies on the floor and what we call tummy time. Which again, in the beginning, none of the mums will put the babies down because they would hold them on their laps, and it was more like a security blanket for them. So this, when you say to many people, tummy time, they go, oh, but that's nothing. In the prison, it's a big issue. And it took a lot of time and a lot of trust just to even get them to sit on the floor. And by just gently modeling, gradually, they began to put their babies onto the floor. We also talked about toys that was in the facility that was brought in by people that we could use for transferring and holding, grasping, rolling, and what we can use for simple movement. Again, when we were looking at tummy time, because the room was always nice and warm, we got them to strip the babies down just to their nappies and vest. So again, we're not worried about clothing. Again, we spoke a lot about language development. This was the ideal times for the mothers to speak with their babies. Again, so we used to talk about the importance of language development. And we also spoke about that from in the pregnancy group, that this from about 7 months in utero, that the babies can recognize their mother's voice, and that they can start to hear the sounds within the mother tongue. But one of the things we did find challenging, again, then we had many women from different cultures, was to encourage those mothers to speak their mother tongue to the baby, which was more important, and why, and not trying to speak in English, which their English may be very poor. And I remember one mum saying to me at one point, she said, she didn't do it. She said, I refuse to do this. I'm not doing it. She said, I feel stupid. And then it was coming to a time, I think she was about to leave and her child was coming up to a year. And she started to have visits with her mother because she was going to be deported back to Romania. And she now realized that when her mother was talking to her child who came over to the UK, her child couldn't understand what her mother was saying. And she came back and apologized and said, I wish I did in the beginning, but I said, you've still got time. It's not too late. But it really takes time to get through to these ladies because they have been damaged in many ways. So they take a long time to trust what you say. We also encourage reading and singing to the babies. Again, so things that don't cost anything, things that don't need materials, things that were very simple to hand, but has great, huge potentials for the young child's development. So one of the importance of movement, and what Dr. Montessori talks about, movement helps for development of the mind. And this finds renewed expression in further movement and activity. And the mothers saw the benefits of when they put these children down on the floor mat. That sometimes, just like I had technical problems getting in, I used to have technical problems getting into the prison. And what we used to find now, that on a Friday, if we had difficulty getting in, the women would set the room up. They knew we were coming, and they would set it up, and they would be ready with their babies in their vest, ready to be sitting on the floor, ready, waiting for us. So when people used to ask us, how do we know what we were doing worked? This was our tangible evidence. The women were there each week, and they were now starting to do the simple task that we were doing with their babies weekly. Because again, these women find it hard to trust without being judged. So they always feel everything they're doing, they're being judged by what they're doing. And they realize we weren't judging them. We were just accepting them who they were for where they were. So some of our achievements, as I said, the mothers will now start to plan and prepare the room for the group. Some of the mature mothers started to plan cooking lessons with the much younger mothers when it came to those babies who needed weaning. So they weren't just now asking for packet foods, they were asking for fresh fruit and vegetables. So they would be able to show how to make a vegetable pie or something from scratch rather than a microwave dish that was just put into the microwave. Also, the mothers now started to express their hopes for themselves and for their babies once they started to be released from prison. But the only thing that many of the women would always say, and it was one of the things we said, you have to always be honest with your children, is that they were never going to tell them that they were born within the prison system. But with today's society and technology, these children will always find it because there's a paper trace and there's also Google that will explain where your mother was if she committed a crime, because there's a trace of that in the newspaper. So we always said one of the things you're going to have to be hard, it's going to be a hard conversation, but when your child is old enough, you need to be honest, because if they can't trust you as their parents, who can they trust in this world? So as well as our work in the prison, we also started to work with senior lecturer Laura Abbott, who also now wrote a thesis on women and babies giving birth within the prison system. As Yoko said, I also volunteer with Birth Companions, who also works within the prison systems as well as women in the community, but I deal with the women in the community. Tracy Forsyth, who was part of the British Pregnancy Advisory Service, and she found our work fascinating, but also it gave her access to the ladies, because as much as some women was having their 9th baby, they did not understand their bodies and also the different types of contraceptions that was available. So she was able to come and join our group once a month, where the women now built a relationship where they will meet her on an individual basis to talk about contraception when leaving the prison. So hopefully they can space out their children. We also used to work with the medical staff at Bronzefield, and we used to attend the maternity liaison committee meetings that were held once every 3 months. So people used to come to us now to rely on our expertise and knowledge of the women, and more so because everyone focused on the women, but we actually focused on the child development. So as Dr. Montessori said, the child is the forgotten citizen. So society must now turn its attention to him and create an environment that will fulfill his vital needs. So even wherever you are, as long as you can have a space, we can create an environment that meets the fundamental needs of the child. It doesn't have to be a perfect environment, because I wasn't in a perfect environment. I just had a floor and a blanket and made use of what we had. And that was what we supported the child's development. And what's really been exciting is that in 2022, that I was approached by an organisation in Mexico who had heard about our initiative in the UK, and they told us that what they would like to do, but they had one advantage. The prisons over there wasn't as strict as getting into as the UK, one, but two, they were able to go in every day, which I thought was amazing. But they were also able to set up a nursery, which was one of the things we'd love to do here, but wasn't able to do. So now they've taken it one step further, which is an amazing to see that they're able to set up a 0 to 3 environment for those babies and mothers to watch those child development grow and prosper. So as it's been nice to know that we've inspired some other countries in the great work that they've also been doing. And from Eduardo Cavas, that's his email address. So if anybody wants to get in touch with them in Mexico, which I'm sure we'll make available at the end so they can find out a little bit more. But they have been able to continue, as I said, the work within the prison and do some fantastic work with the mothers as well. So that's the end of that from me, and thank you so much for listening today.
Thank you so much, Beverley. I'm sure everybody was being completely fascinated by what you had to share. And we already had some questions for Noah, and I was just wondering, are there questions for Beverley? I'm sure there must be loads of questions, waiting to be asked. Just don't hesitate. Just ask them and put them in the chat.
Both Noah and I can go on and share many stories, but we know we have a time constraint.
Oh, well, perhaps Noah has a question for you. That would be nice.
Beverley, what an amazing presentation and such amazing work you're doing. It's just extraordinary. Maybe you could talk a little bit about, do you see any relevance to over managing the hurried child? You're in an environment where that's kind of not an issue. It's the other extreme, but how do you navigate that?
I think, you see, the only thing is within the prison, the women still have to operate within the prison system. So the women get 6 weeks maternity. So for the first 6 weeks, once they've given birth, they're not expected to do education or work on the house blocks. So, and also for those women, that's the only way they make an income, if they've got no family members sending any money in. So if they need to make phone calls to a family member, the work on the house block pays them to be able to buy those luxuries. So for the first 6 weeks after the baby's born, they're not allowed to work. And then the prison has a nursery that is provided again, but again, the hours is very short. So it allows the women just to work only in the mornings. And then they're there with their babies in the afternoon.
Yeah. Well, I have a question here in the chat who Maria asked, does someone know if this can be done in the prison system of the United States? Now, Beverley, you're not a US citizen, so I'm not sure.
Thing is, I don't know, but then we didn't know it was going to work in the UK, actually. So one of the things was, it was a series of meetings with, we actually went in through the health authority. So we actually went in through the mental health team and that. So we were able to show lots of what was the benefits, why we thought this is going to work. We had lots and lots of meetings with the different psychotherapist teams and psychiatric nurses and everything else. And because one of the key things, because Pamela actually worked within the system herself, that got us in a little bit easier as well.
Yeah. So
that was our way. But it always, as everything in the Montessori world, starts with a conversation.
Yeah.
So it's finding the right people, having the right conversation, and then who knows what can happen.
Yeah. And someone, Shraddha, is asking for clarification. Does it mean that child and mother both are in prison after the child's birth?
Yes, depending on the circumstances. Some mothers, if they're depending on the nature of their crime, if they could serve their sentence and be given birth in the communities, some could be given up to 2 years. So if the mother we had a mum who was going to face a 10-year sentence. So she was able to keep the baby till the baby was 9 months old. And then there was going to be a separation because we know she had another 9 years to serve in prison. So it's not fair on the child. So they did an early separation, and that the child was then put into a foster family. And then that one of the conditions was to bring the baby to visit the mother regularly to the prison. But I'm going to say that system always sometimes break down because, again, when the mothers have a longer sentence, they also get moved around the UK. So sometimes a mother could be based as far as Scotland. So again, it will cost on the family to get a child to visit. And sometimes it can take a whole day for a 1-hour visit, that some families don't bring the children. So then becomes a breakdown within the family relationship.
Yeah, I think, does that also, this answer that you've just given, does it also take on board the question we find here, is there a continuous support for the child after the mother's release?
No, nobody ever focuses on the child. They always focus on the mother, but nobody focused on the child. That's what was so unique about our project. We actually were the ones that focused on child development. Everybody looked at the mother's needs and what the mother wanted and what was going on in the mother's life, but no one ever looked at the child, which was the difference with us. We looked at the child's development within the prison structure, within the mother's mental health stability, but no one else did.
Thank you. Great. Any more questions? Because we still have a little time left. So I say grab the opportunity. Isn't it that negative for child as in his environment? I'm not sure if that's a response to, if that was an earlier question or a response to.
It's not negative for the child because the environment they come into, for them, that's all they know. They haven't known anything different. So to them, that is their home. And we forget that that is a home for the child. And there was once, we had a situation, we had a little boy, he was in the community and he came in at 5 months because his mother committed a crime and she was sentenced when he was 5 months old. So he was born actually in the community and then brought into the prison because there was actually a space, and she fought and got him in. And her release, he was 16 months when she was about to be released. So for the first, from he was 5 months old, this is his home. He got up every morning, he sat around the table with the same other children who he ate breakfast with, he sat around the table with the same other children he ate lunch with, and he sat around the table and had dinner with the same children. And one of the things we forget that when we talked about, and it wasn't until we kept talking about separation and talking to the children, and the mothers used to say, they're not going to understand, they're not going to understand. And then one mother said she started to observe. The mum was packing down his room, herself, and starting to send all his belongings home and hers. And they noticed a change in his behaviour. They noticed he was really a bubbly child, but now he was very withdrawn. They also noticed that when anyone talked to him, he would always hold his head down. He wasn't as bubbly as he was because he knew there was a change. But because he couldn't verbalize it, he was expressing it in this way. And they said on the last day, when his mum, obviously she's excited to go, he wouldn't say goodbye to nobody. He wouldn't look at anybody. He just walked with his head down. And this mum said she then realized, watching this, how the importance of preparing a child, no matter how young they are, for that sort of separation, because he was losing his home. As much as we say prison is bad, this was his home. This was his space for the last, 12 months of his life. This is what he knew. And now it's going to be taken away and he's going into the unknown.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think I'm going to take one more question. And after that, I'm going to thank you all, but then I'm going to quote one of the participants because they put it so nicely. But anyway, the last question we're going to take for today is, if a woman has trauma being pregnant, does this affect the unborn child in his or her adult life if it doesn't get therapy?
That's a question you can't answer on its own, because it's an individual. It depends on the trauma. It depends on the situation that the mother is in. You know, it's not in isolation. Fortunate, some of these women in the prison system do get the help that they may never have got if they were left in society, especially where domestic abuse is really prevalent. You know, so again, everything's got to be taken on an individual case, an individual merit, and hopefully that if the mother is open to seek therapy, but again, in the UK, getting therapy is not straightforward and an easy thing. So again, that is a question that's not straightforward to answer.
Yeah, okay. Well, I say if there's any questions remaining that you think of afterwards, because you know that sometimes that happens often. You think, oh, if only I'd asked that. You can always send an email to our info address, and we'll make sure it gets to either Noah or Beverley, and I'm sure they will be very happy to give out more information. And I just wanted to sort of quote Anne Young here in the chat to everyone, who said, Beverley and Noah, thank you very much for you both, inspiring, and it gives me so much encouragement in my work as an advocate for children who are in the court system, babies in foster care, that's in the USA. This kind of work could be done and is needed at that platform too. Court-appointed special advocates are focusing on the child. So basically that is a really big thank you, and that echoes also lots of other comments left in the chat. That thank you both for excellent contribution.